And one of his most famous skits is playing the piano with his penis.
Yes, I have heard that.
Hi, I'm Andy,
And I'm Roger,
and welcome to The Middle,
where we try to have thoughtful conversations
about awkward topics.
on our search to find the middle.
That's fatphobic.
I don't build wall. I just own operate a seawall.
A few moments ago, Buckingham Palace announced the death of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II.
I act as if God exists.
Put your masks on.
How dare you! You have stolen my dreams, my childhood, with your empty words.
Hey Roger, how you going?
How you doing?
Pretty good. What's the most ridiculous spivvy phrase you've ever heard at work?
What did you call it?
Spivvy phrase.
What does that mean?
Well, you know, like when you get consultants in and then, you know, instead of saying, we don't know the answer to that, they'll say something like, we don't have visibility over that. Or, you know, they'll pepper in all these like jargony terms to make them sound more
Yeah,
knowledgeable.
Man. I've heard so many. I tend to like wipe it from my mind. I kind of think the bit that really gets me, the one that's going around a lot at the moment is we just need to really focus on socializing this. And they often what they really mean is sending a PowerPoint pack around to as many people as they can before a meeting, so that it goes down really well at the meeting. And they use that term all the time. It's like, oh, we really need to socialize this pack. And I'm like, what is this pack? Like a freaking 4-year-old at preschool trying to gain friends? Like, it just really irks me.
I actually like the term socialize because for me it reflects, like, it has a meaning that's a bit different to we need to share or consult or engage or whatever. It's
a dressed up word though.
Well, yeah, no. So I totally get that because like here I am, you know, bringing this up to get on the attack, but I'm just saying like I use it, so I'm guilty as charged. But I think I like it because it reflects that you're not seeking approval for something, that you're actually seeking people's sort of input or agreement, or for them to shape it in a way such that they do agree with it.
Yeah. I mean, the other one that comes to mind a lot, and it's kind of died down a bit more, or maybe it's just the circles that I've pulled out of, but for a while, it was always boiling the ocean. That was a term that was used all the time, right? Like, we don't want to boil the ocean on this one. Pretty much try to cut off at the knees any further questions around, like, the what-if scenarios, right? So they present something and the group would challenge it around, oh, you haven't thought about this, so what happens if, you know, this vendor doesn't come to the table? And they're just like, oh, well, we don't want to boil the ocean on this one. And they're trying to like move across the narrative.
So very quickly, just before we move on, have you ever used any of the following phrases? Number 1, take this offline.
Unfortunately, yes.
Number 2, let's circle back to that.
No.
Number 3, need to get client buy-in.
Drop the client and then, yeah, okay.
Number 4, seeing how the sausage is made.
Definitely not.
Number 5, we'll align and get back to you.
Yes.
Number 6, I don't have the bandwidth.
Not that I remember. No. It sounds like something maybe I would have said.
And last one, what's your meeting cadence?
No. Thank God. Oh, the other one that comes to mind is there are many ways to skin a cat. That's something that's used a lot as well. Or this one, actually, the one that comes up all the time. We had one particular partner that used to use this one all the time, right? Like, he'd come in late to the meeting, he'd listen to someone else present something, and then he'd just sit there with his legs crossed and just say, so what's the so what factor? I'm really missing the so what. And he'd use that line over and over again and disrupt the whole presentation. And it's like he read about what double loop questioning means in some kind of ongoing training seminar he had, and he's just overusing it like crazy.
I find that I get really self-conscious when I notice myself using a certain phrase a lot. So the one that like I have to like slap myself on the wrists every time I use it is thread the needle.
Ooh, I don't mind thread the needle.
Obviously I like it because I've been using it, but like I noticed that I've been overusing it recently. So I was just like, no, don't use that.
Yeah, you can fall into that trap, I think, and especially if you come from a background where you're using a type of tool, like, say, for example, like you subscribe to Lean Six Sigma or Agile and things like that. The whole learning program definitely sets you up with a vernacular and a phrasing that you tend to use. So you have to be careful.
All right, Roger. So, what are we talking about today?
Some of our listeners have been talking to us, and we're always open to where we should go with different episode topics. And one that has actually kind of leapt out in front of a lot of other topics is the conflict in Ukraine and obviously the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I had quite a few people talk to me wanting us to have a look at this topic. And the common thing was this feeling that they knew something really important was happening, but they felt like because of the history, because of the complexity, they felt like they really couldn't engage in a conversation about the conflict without looking or feeling ignorant or feeling a bit stupid. So that's what we decided to delve into today. And it's a big topic. It's a bigger responsibility than some of the other issues because it's an ongoing conflict with real lives being impacted.
Let's call a spade a spade. Most people in America, in Australia, in maybe those in Europe are a bit closer to it, can't even point to a map of where all this stuff's happening, right? Don't know really much about Ukraine, might not really understand much about Russia and what's really going on in Russia. So it's hard to discuss a conflict that doesn't resonate with us because there aren't those sort of cultural overlaps, and that doesn't necessarily affect us immediately in our, like, we're not in Europe sort of under threat. So, and I think just to echo, I think how you presented it in terms of people not feeling equipped to have a meaningful conversation about this, I must admit, like, I would say that describes me as well. I didn't feel, although we have done some research in preparation for this episode, but, and I think we would probably both be in the same camp that we didn't have much of a foothold in this discussion, but maybe as amateur kind of people interested in what's going on in the world, now we have a bit of a better idea and feel better equipped to discuss it.
Yeah, I think so. And in the spirit of, our show in the middle, we're going to really challenge ourselves on some of the narratives. But like always, this is going to be a conversation, a good faith conversation between you and I. And I hope, for everyone who's listening, you can take this as what it is, which is a conversation between two people trying to get their head around the conflict. And hopefully we'll give each other some space to do that. But I don't know, Andy, I mean, as we were doing a little bit of research and preparing for this episode, I don't know about you, but I really have you seen the Fifth Element?
Yes, I have.
There's
a long time ago, though.
Yeah, it's a great movie. But there's a scene in there where there's obviously this kind of alien, right, in human form, and this woman, and she's catching up on human history, and she watches it at 10 times speed, and she's trying to get up to speed, and it goes through all the footage of World War One and World War Two and all the conflicts and everything, and then she just starts to cry and break down and lose faith in humanity, and takes like a little while to kind of come back to being normal. And I must admit, there were some times during this last week that I kind of felt the same, seeing some of the footage and seeing like what's going on in there and hearing the firsthand accounts and all this kind of stuff. I did feel a bit like that. I started to lose a little bit of faith in how we treat each other. And like you said, we're so far removed from it in Australia and in different parts of the world that it almost like you come back to your normal life and you're like, your perspective is really shattered. It's like people getting annoyed about, bins being too far on people's lawns, every Tuesday, let alone what's happening on the other side of the world. I don't know. How did you feel kind of preparing for this episode?
Well, I guess just to emphasize the point, I mean, we're talking like in the order of 200,000 military casualties out of this conflict. So this isn't just like a skirmish or something, right? This is quite significant. We're also talking about people whose, communities have been destroyed, whose cities, places, homes, whole lives have been absolutely ruined. And so it is quite real. But I guess just to touch on the notion of like the middle and what we're going to do today, like, if you live in the West, it's very easy to place all of this stuff that's happened in a very simple good versus evil paradigm. And I think that's largely how that's the heuristic that most people are applying when it comes to this. And, after everything that I've looked at this week, I don't think I would necessarily change my view of the horror of it, and certainly the degree or the accountability that, Russia and Putin, maybe perhaps more specifically, should have over this. And, they are really have a lot to answer for. But nonetheless, it is a lot more complicated than just evil versus good. There's a lot of different stuff going on, and I think that's what we should get into a little bit today.
I agree, Andy, and I think there's still this hangover from the World War II narrative with the Allied versus Axis powers, right? This idea that Hitler was such an overwhelmingly evil force in the world, and we're the heroes, right? In the Allied powers helping the world, and I think there's that hangover of that narrative that we want to believe from there, and that extends on obviously onto like Cold War and things like that. So when we talk about the Ukraine conflict and the Russian invasion, let's give a quick summary.
All right. So I will give my Cliff Notes version of Russian and Ukrainian history to now, which I think is quite important in the context of certainly some of the propaganda that has been put out there on the Russian side. You could probably spend a lifetime trying to understand this stuff and still not get it. So I'm going to have some humility and say that my understanding is quite superficial, and don't come to me, so I'm certainly not an expert. But I think there is this contention that, Ukraine and Russia was always just this one thing, and then it was split apart at the end of the Soviet Union, and that, in some ways, like the reunification is, this country called Ukraine is essentially a fiction. It's an artificial thing that was created. But my understanding is that's not actually correct, that over many centuries of history, there was a very distinct Ukrainian identity, not least of which, it's a different language to Russian. There's different religious institutions in Ukraine, including part of Ukraine, which is connected into the Roman Catholic Church rather than the Orthodox Church. I don't think we have either the expertise or the time to trawl through the centuries of history, but I think for the purposes of this conversation, if we can kind of bundle it all up in a black box and say that, yes, there was this distinct Ukrainian identity, and when people today identify as Ukrainian, that's not just a construct of the last 25 years or 30 years or whenever. That's something that that has very, a very long history.
Yeah, that's right. I think there's always been this view that, Ukraine or that territory has been this axis or this gatekeeper between, the East and West, or Europe and the East, right?
The gates of Europe.
That's right. And also, when you go right back, and we're not going to go right back, but the beginnings of what Russia was really started in Ukraine in a way, right? Like the capital was there, and the kind of empire grew from Ukraine out to East, really. So there is, going right back, there is that they sometimes view it as the seat of Russia in a way, that built from there.
Yeah.
Let's
So Roger, we've outlined some of the historical context, but why don't you bring us up to speed in a more contemporary sense? So maybe just walk us through some of the key developments over, say, the past 100 years or so.
So first, I guess we'll start with the Soviet period, right? World War II rolls around in 1939, and Russia is part of the Allied forces fighting against the Nazi occupation in Ukraine and the Baltics, and of course, the Allies against the Axis power. By the end of World War II in 1945, Ukraine is back under the USSR. So Ukraine's now kind of territory with Russia, and we head into the Cold War era between 1947 until the collapse of the Soviet Union, the USSR, in 1991. In 1949, NATO is established with 12 founding members, and NATO stands for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and it's really a pact between these European members and the United States and Canada to essentially protect or come to the aid of any of the member countries from military attack. And really that's to balance out the power of the Soviet Union. And we see a kind of establishment of the Warsaw Pact, which is a rival to NATO. And then we fast forward down into 1991, which is the key date where the USSR falls and Ukraine gains its independence and is essentially their own country now, their own sovereign country.
Yeah, so I guess if I could just add in a couple of touch points, which I think are quite relevant to the contemporary conflict. So the first being that Lenin, back in, when the USSR was formed, made a quite conscious, deliberate decision that Ukraine would join as a distinct political unit, recognizing Ukraine as a distinct group of people, not just part of Russia in a historical sense, even though they were part of the USSR. The second thing I would add in there is that in the 60s, Khrushchev, who was the leader of the USSR following the death of Stalin, gifted Crimea, which is a core part of the contemporary war and conflict, to Ukraine. So it was part of Russia and was handed over to Ukraine. And that, I think, reflected maybe historical legacies of where Crimea was, or the people of Crimea had affiliation or, a history with Ukraine. However, Crimea was, home to one of the Black Sea Navy ports for Russia, so it was sort of viewed as sensitive for both sides. And then I guess the third and final thing I just wanted to maybe throw in there is that when the Soviet Union split up, Ukraine, or some of the agitation within Ukraine was actually seen as kind of some of the early signs of the USSR breaking up. So there were some early protests coming together, calling for regime change that actually kicked off in the Ukraine and led to the dissolution of the USSR. And in some ways, some of that history leads us to today, where some people within Russia have kind of a view that Ukraine is to blame for the breakup of what was, the USSR, one of those major sort of world powers prior to 91.
Yeah. Okay, so I think there's a little bit of some key dates and, getting across the concept of the world wars, Russia, the establishment of the USSR, which incorporated Ukraine, and then the breakdown in 1991, where Ukraine gained its independence as well. So that's the kind of modern landscape. Now, of course, very, very high level, but those are kind of the concepts that I think we need to be aware of when handling this. Now, let's talk a little bit about the direct conflict and what has happened. Starting with, I suppose, where I would draw the line on this is probably 2004 and the Orange Revolution. So in 2004, a pro-Russian president, Viktor Yanukovych, wins the election, but is largely seen by the Ukrainian people as a rigged election. They hold something called the Orange Revolution, and essentially the election is overturned, right? So there's already this history of Russia interfering or influencing Ukrainian politics. In 2010, Yanukovych is back, and this time he wins the election and it is ratified. So what kind of happens over the next 3 to 4 years, in 2013 to 2014, a series of civilian protests referred to as the Euromaidan, where the people of Ukraine are getting increasingly frustrated that they are not aligning and making a deal to join the European Union. And it starts off as a protest on that due to back channeling with Russian interests. And then it rapidly moves from there into this idea of anti-corruption and freedom. And that escalates to the point where there are lots of violent altercations with peaceful protests, and there are long-standing kind of conflicts between the civilian population and the police force there, which is admittedly very brutal. And it ultimately ends in Yanukovych being pushed out of the Ukrainian presidency and being exiled back to Russia. Fast forward to this, in 2014, Vladimir Putin in Russia decides to take Russian troops and invade Crimea and eventually annexes Crimea to Russia with the support of a referendum with the Russian people.
Well, the people of Crimea.
They have a referendum, and Crimea is annexed to Russia.
Yeah, so I guess with a lot of that, a key touch point for Ukraine at that period of history was, does it kind of stick with Russia and double down its relationship with Russia and almost be a vassal state of Russia in a little bit the way that contemporary Belarus is?
A puppet president.
Correct. Or does Ukraine integrate more with Western Europe and politically too, and indeed NATO? This is where NATO comes in as well, because the suggestion is that that Ukraine will join NATO, and this is not something that Russia obviously is particularly fond of, this idea. And there's also some other sensitivities, like in Crimea, for example. That's where Russia has a military presence, it has its navy base there, and that is something that was tenable under a kind of a pro-Russian regime, but when it looks like there's a bit of uncertainty, suddenly becomes a bigger deal, and then that's why they move into Crimea.
And I would say that this is actually quite an important point that we start here in 2014, because it's one of the very explicit points of evidence that the Ukrainian people, especially the youth of Ukraine, want to be aligned to Europe. So a big part of the protest was that by not signing a deal with the European Union, that they were somehow being set back and their future and their children's future were being sacrificed due to corruption. So it's a good place to kind of establish the will of the people, which will play later on in terms of motivations for further invasions.
Yeah. And then, so I guess moving on from 2014, look, I think just to be completely upfront and not to sugarcoat anything, life in Ukraine was not easy, right? There were a lot of challenges with things like corruption, pensioners not getting paid their pension at all or on time or whatever. And there was sort of a strong sense of it wasn't functioning very well. In part, that might have amplified or given a push to join the EU and to become part of that world. But equally, people were very cynical with the Ukrainian political system. Lots of deep cynicism for the political establishment. You've got oligarchs with various other influences. You've got corrupt police forces and so on during this time. So I guess one of the things that they did was restore an earlier constitution following the 2014 protests and Yanukovych's exile to Russia, and Poroshenko is elected president, who was a pro EU sort of leader. However, was not delivering on the things that people in Ukraine sought. And then in 2019, they have another presidential election, and this guy, Zelensky. Now, we all know who Zelensky is now because we see him on the news every night, and he's quite the spokesperson on behalf of Ukrainian people. But his history, and people may know this, but just in case you don't, he was like the Ricky Gervais of Ukraine. So he played a school teacher who somehow became president in a sitcom in the Ukraine, and life imitating art, art imitating life. He announces, he registers his party, his fake, his party that was made up for his TV show. He registers it in real life. He runs for the presidency, and he wins in a landslide. He is
well, Andy. There's hope for us all, because actually you painted his resume in quite a good light there. But one could take it from another angle, that actually he started a comedy group when he was very young, and he's actually most famous for his skits. And one of his most famous skit that he has done many times actually is playing the piano with his penis.
Yes, I have heard that.
And it was celebrated quite a lot on Ukrainian TV. So he's a comic, and he's famous for his risque skits.
Yes. And look, I think in some ways, like, it's, just sort of think, I guess, about Donald Trump in some ways, this whole mass media and, kind of some crazy stuff happened around that time, right? So maybe it's not so crazy,
right,
but yeah, he ran on a platform of stamping out corruption because that was seen as like a big priority. He wasn't actually a pro-European candidate. He was more about peace and stability, sue for peace sort of thing. Like he was, I think, the candidate that basically said to the Ukrainian people, look, your lives right now, you're not happy. I'm the person who's going to come in and cut get rid of all the things that you don't like. We're not, and that includes, like, we don't want you anxious about conflicts with Russia. We don't want you worried that your pensions aren't being paid on time. So I'm your guy. And I think that's broadly, I mean, obviously, we're saying this, with a bit of humility, that we're not completely across the details, but that's broadly what happened.
And Andy, funnily enough, in 2020, Zelensky was really, really, really struggling politically. His approval rating was plummeting, and he couldn't seem to get the change around the corruption and power away from the oligarchs that he promised. and his approval rating was really low, like sub 20%. And it's actually the war that has saved him politically in some ways, obviously now with a 99% approval rating, obviously as a wartime president. But it's politics is a funny game.
So yeah, I mean, like he was Zelensky trying to keep his head above water. Then we have a few instances where he gets like totally owned by Putin. So one of the examples was like a prisoner arrangement. Like this was part of the whole like peace kind of, we're suing for peace, so we're going to do this like prisoner swap agreement, and it's all negotiated, and Zelensky and Putin are kind of, you know, about to announce it. Zelensky announces it, and then Putin says after he's announced it, yeah, actually, we've changed our minds. We're only going to do this if you give us more prisoners. And by that stage, like Zelensky's announced it, so he has no alternative. So he has to kind of agree. And so like Putin's just always like vying for the upper hand. Like he's never, he's just trying to like toy with him. There's a few things like that happen. And I think that's when Zelensky probably realizes who he's dealing with, and good faith from his side will not necessarily be reciprocated. Without getting into the reasons and why this happened, but there were several occasions throughout the years kind of leading up to the actual invasion where there were kind of big deployments of troops on the Russian border, where it was kind of seen as like a way of extracting concessions, or, you know, scaring Ukraine to do things in Russia's favor, or maybe not to do things, right? So yeah, it was intimidation, and that had happened, you know, many times, or at least more than once before. So when this happened in early 2022, this was kind of viewed as, you know, sort of, okay, they're doing this again. We're like, it's unthinkable that war will come, you know, but they've been sort of on a knife's edge for some years anyway. And then there was intelligence from the United States. You had the clips of President Biden basically saying, yes, you know, that they will invade. And I guess it's thought that was, those sort of remarks were based on intelligence from within Russia that made its way to the United States, and indeed, yes, they did invade. All right, so Roger, Russia's invaded. Tell me a bit about kind of what the last essentially year has been like.
Yeah. Okay. So I mean, I think it's clear that Putin expected this war to be over quickly, and to be honest, a lot of, you know, the international response was that the Ukraine would be folded quite quickly. In the same way, you know, Crimea was taken, and the force of, obviously, the overwhelming force of the Russian army and so on. I think it was very much that blitzkrieg, go in, take Kiev, the capital Kiev, and Zelensky would be fleeing the country and be in exile. That's not what happened at all. The Ukrainian opposition, the military aid that was provided internationally, and the will of the people to fight, not only the will of the people to fight, but the will of Zelensky to bring the country together, was totally miscalculated. And what essentially has happened is that while there was a short period where Russian gains were made in the east and also around Kiev, once aid came from international parties, especially in terms of military aid and weapons, the last year has been Ukraine essentially regaining over 50% of any territories that the Russians have taken since the initial invasion.
Just to kind of maybe rebalance that a little bit and give the Ukrainians a little bit more credit where it's due, you know, I think what maybe the turning point was, you know, was less so kind of extra support from outside of Ukraine, but in some ways the incompetence of the Russian military and the ingenuity of Ukrainians on the ground. So, for example, I think the Russians went in there thinking that the Ukrainian people would welcome them with salt and bread, I think is the saying, that that they would be welcomed as liberators of the country, and that obviously wasn't the case. And they didn't get their supply lines up to their tanks arranged, and you know, yeah, the tanks went however, you know, in a tank column, however far they went, but you know, there's this, like talking about the ingenuity of the Ukrainians, they said, well, we're not going to attack the tanks. What we're going to do is let the tanks pass, and we're actually going to go and attack the supply lines. So then these tanks just fizzled out, and then so that's how they captured all the tanks. So and that's actually, like, you know, teams of 30 people that did that kind of thing. So yeah, and then obviously now it's, and actually, sorry, just to the, the supply of weapons, one of the interesting dynamics at the time was America, for example, was quite fearful of providing weapons to Ukraine early on, because if it was going to be a really quick, short, sharp conflict, they didn't want the weapons falling into the hands of Russia. So
Yeah.
it was only after, kind of Ukraine had sort of really,
Shown
actually
real resistance.
exactly, that they got the extra support.
It was very much, there are accounts of the first wave of Russian army resources coming through with as little as 3 days ration in some departments. So you can see that they weren't quite prepared. And what we've seen play out in the last year is actually the technological difference between what we've seen, at least in the Russian armed forces, compared to modern military equipment of NATO standard issue weapons, and obviously the United States Army as well. I think that for a long time there was this thought that the US advanced weapons didn't work so well in their modern warfare, and that was mainly on skirmishes and other kind of parts of the world and Afghanistan. But what we're seeing now is it's working incredible against a Soviet-style force of army. And I've been amazed actually learning about some of these systems that things like the Javelin and these tank missiles that actually can shoot 40 kilometers and land directly on top of the tanks and neutralize them, that are fired by someone over the shoulder, a single person. It's amazing.
It is interesting hearing all the tactical kind of elements to this, with one being the professionalism of the Russian army just simply wasn't there. So where they had recruited people who were inexperienced, there's, a significant number of the people who have been involved on the Russian side to date have been ex-prisoners, right, who were essentially provided the opportunity to go and fight instead of being in prison, and really are not trained and well tooled in kind of modern warfare. And the other aspect being that they weren't able to secure dominance in the air, so they tried to take over the airport north of Kyiv and failed, and so they haven't had air superiority, and that has meant it has had to be a war on the ground. It has had to be one involving troops and artillery, and it's because no one has dominance in the air. So there's all these different elements that have shaped the conflict to date.
All right, so we'll cover a little bit about the context and what's been happening over the last year of the conflict in Ukraine. But a big question that comes next is, why is it happening? What does Putin want, and what is he saying to the world?
I think we need to have two columns. We need to have the stated reasons that he has been communicating to the Russian people, and that form part of what you could either call propaganda or like the comms campaign around this, right?
Yeah, the PR spin.
Yeah, and some of that, like, that's predominantly to a domestic audience because that's who he's speaking to, but it's also as well to maybe some of the countries that need a kind of at least a plausible deniability as to why it's okay for them to support Russia, or still buy oil or gas from Russia, for example. So I think there's probably four kind of narratives that I could point to. So the first is this notion of NATO expansionism. And I might start with that because I think that's the one that's actually the most credible on the Russian side. That's the one that may have an element of truth to it, isn't necessarily purely spin. So that's the first one. And just to go through the others, you have then, which are kind of very fast decreasing kind of credibility, allegations of Nazis and fascism in Ukraine, and the threat that has to Russian ethnic populations within Ukraine. Then you have, and so this is like a humanitarian exercise to help ethnic Russian people or people who identify as Russian within the Ukraine. Then you have the notion that this is in defense of Russia, that Russia is actually under attack, and that Russia needs to act because there'll be troops coming into Russia, which might be kind of a an extension of the NATO argument, but it's a bit different. And this is something we've heard in more recent speeches. So it's not necessarily something that was talked about at the beginning of the conflict, but has now kind of been brought out as a more as a new rationale.
Yeah.
And of course, I think just maybe not necessarily another rationale, but certainly something that applies to all of them, is that from the perspective of the typical Russian person, this war is not being fought against Ukraine. This war is being fought against America. So this is a war against America and the West, and Ukraine doesn't figure.
Just another proxy war.
Yes. And so this is, and of course, all of those revolutions that happened in Ukraine, they were all caused by America. The people of Ukraine actually weren't behind it, that it was just, American agents operating in Russia that so there's a lot of misleading information within Russia about the true views and perspectives of the Ukrainian people. And the fourth one is a narrative that Putin started spinning back in 2021, perhaps to give cover for the conflict, was that actually, the USSR should never have split up, that Ukraine should have always been and should remain part of Russia, and that it's the worst thing that's ever happened to Russia was the breakup of the Soviet Union. And at the moment there's spheres of influence, but kind of losing Ukraine was, and then there's this 2021 essay where he talks through, and it's a bit of a apparently he wrote it himself during COVID, and he did his own research, and it was I'm sure it's been pulled apart by Ukrainian historians and others, but yeah, essentially making the argument that this is just restoring the natural order, which is that Ukraine is actually part of Russia, and that's like the fourth kind of rationale for the war.
Yeah, great. So what I'd like to do is probably start at the start, which is Putin's official reasoning to his people and the world on why he was sending troops into Ukraine. And at the time, he raised it as an urgent humanitarian mission to essentially liberate the eastern parts of Ukraine, or in the Donbass region, where Russians were being persecuted essentially by Nazis and fascism. So that was the line that was kind of given. Can we have a look at that and actually understand where the sprinklings come from in there, what is true, what's actually misleading?
Yeah, well, I guess there's obviously some groups of people in those parts of Ukraine that identify as Russian and do support, Russian control and do want to be part of Russia. So I don't think it's strictly the case that that everyone kind of supported being part of the nation of Ukraine at that time in those parts of Ukraine. However, from what I understand, and I sort of say this kind of accepting that there's a lot of different information and that you can't always trust everything that's coming out, but from what I understand is that now in those regions, the amount of hardship that they've gone through as a result of this war has sapped dry any, like, they haven't been welcomed. Like, the Russians were not welcomed when they came. So when it was like independent actors, or you had kind of groups of militias or whatever running sort of these offensives within Ukraine, and it was like there were separatist movements or whatever, that was different. But now that it's like Russian military, and they've basically, it's resulted in like their cities and homes being destroyed as a consequence, it's been a different story. But yeah. I guess leading up to it, I don't know that much about it and what the experience was on the ground, but it's sort of a bit like, you bullied that kid over there, so we're just going to beat the shit out of all of you to like, it's like the solution is worse than the initial complaint.
All right, well, let's make a call on this one, because I do think it's something that comes up a lot, that there is a Nazi element operating in Ukraine. That obviously harks back to some of the history that we spoke about, and there was a small population that did side with the Nazis back in World War II, but that equally there was many millions of Ukrainians that fought the Nazis as well.
I think that the Nazi thing is very tricky. So in Russia, given that certain people in the Ukrainian population fought against the Soviet Union in the Second World War, which kind of by definition means they fought on the Nazi side, but really they were fighting against the Soviet Union because the Soviet Union was quite brutal. There were famines and all this sort of stuff that followed. So it wasn't there wasn't a lot of fondness for the Soviet Union in Ukraine, at least for some. So they also reflected on their experiences during the First World War, where there was an occupation by Germany, and it, I think, was not seen as that bad. So they were kind of reflecting on that. Well, which devil do we prefer? But that happened has kind of really sowed rich soil in Russia for any sense that Ukraine harbors Nazi sympathizers. It's just been this really fertile soil for those sorts of conspiracies. And I think in any country, you will be able to take photos of Nazis, skinheads, whatever, people with Nazi tattoos, whatever, because they exist. It's a fact of life. Now, I'm happy to concede that there are some elements of that in Ukraine, but is that genuinely a kind of a good faith, genuine factor explaining this war? I don't think so.
Yeah, I think totally agree. For me, the tricky bit here is that it probably does need to be acknowledged that Nazis, as you mentioned, a kind of neo-Nazi element exists in all countries. But in terms of Ukraine and that presence, there is a little bit more than, say, for example, Australia. And there have been some kind of incidents where, we have politicians erecting statues of members who essentially were Nazi proxies historically. And there's a little bit more of that going on in that part of the world, I suppose. It is being used for cover. And of course, Zelensky is Jewish himself. There's 150,000 Jews in Ukraine, and they enjoy freedoms and protections of anti-Semitic acts and anything like that. So it can hardly be called a neo-Nazi operating country. But I think it does need to be acknowledged that there's more of this neo-Nazi element in Ukraine at the moment.
Well, maybe the relevant question isn't whether there's more neo-Nazi elements in the Ukraine than Australia, but is there any more of these elements in the Ukraine than there is in Russia now? I'm not sure there is. I mean, it might not be neo-Nazis per se, but it might be equivalent right-wing extreme groups.
Far-right groups.
Yeah, and it's. I guess the reason why I think we need to be careful in discussing this in the context of the war is that to what extent does this account for the decision making of Vladimir Putin and his government? And I think it doesn't weigh into his decision making, other than to the extent that it's factored in as a narrative that can be spun to justify the war.
Agree. Okay, let's move on to NATO expansion. And expansion is the key word here. Not only has it grown from its original 12 countries to what is it now, 30, it's been pushing eastward in its membership, which was something of a gentleman's agreement to Russia that it would not expand east, including some of the Baltic countries that were part of the Warsaw Pact that was aligned with the Communist Party. And there's also been examples of operating war games and other training exercise right on the border with full military operations that would definitely make Russia quite nervous as well, with missiles that could range them. So how much do we put in this idea that part of this conflict was escalated or provoked by NATO expansion?
I think I want to talk about actions and is there some different set of actions that could have reduced risk? So it's not necessarily us justifying whether it's right or wrong. So for example, another country should have the right to do whatever it wants. We're not in the world of, spheres of influence and things like that, where a big country gets to dominate and decide what other countries do. So if Lithuania wants to join NATO, Lithuania should be able to join NATO, right? So it's not quite looking at it through that lens, because one view might be, well, of course they should be able to, but it's more looking at it through the lens of, well, from Russia's perspective, is there some basis for this to give rise to concern and view this as a risk? And I guess to then take it then to the next point, is there any different course of action that could have been taken? For example, the United States basically saying, well, look, we support a strong and robust NATO, but we're going to honor the agreement. We're not going to poke the bear, sort of thing, and maybe give themselves, a cover so that they can save face or whatever. But not give Putin a reason to be scared or Russia a reason to be scared.
Or to feel threatened, right?
I guess the second thing I wanted to then kind of just put out there, but in the United States you have the Monroe Doctrine, which is basically that no country should do anything anywhere near the United States that could be seen as
a threat to national security,
a threat to the United States. So it's the Monroe Doctrine is just basically we control this part of the world, every other country fuck off, right? And so I suppose from Russia's standpoint, there's some hypocrisy or whatever going on. Where do you feel NATO, if you had to kind of guess or place a bet, where do you feel it sits in terms of a motivating factor for Putin?
I think I place a bit of weight on it. And the reason I do is not because of, like you said, whether it's the right or wrong decision for countries, in the relative East to join and be members of them, or the sovereignty around those decisions. It's more about, I guess, them understanding what this could lead to in terms of risk. And to me, it's Putin's kind of like a proud Asian uncle, a lot of this is motivated by saving face. He has an identity as a strong man, and he uses that to obviously lead his people. And they talk about, he talks about in his responses how the West is habitually and continually humiliating Russia and not sticking to their promises, not showing any respect, and pushing and pushing. And so I think that I kind of put weight in the NATO expansion argument because it has caused that cascade of responses. And I think that could have been, that seems to be well understood, and Putin has kind of communicated that on, frequently and formally. Whether it's the right thing or whether that should be the case, I'm not commenting, but I do put a bit of weight in the threat and more the kind of the humiliation and respect, the perceived disrespect that Putin is kind of feeling on the encroachment east.
And I think also Putin is probably not concerned about NATO from the perspective of, let's say, an unprovoked attack on Russian soil. I think what he's reacting to is the impact of NATO on Russia's sphere of influence. And let's say moving from a world where Ukraine used to be a country that, was under the thumb of Russia to now a country that's a member of NATO, which is like a 180-degree turn. The Solomon Islands recently signed a deal with China for support, and traditionally Australia has been the key provider of aid and support to develop their government and institutions and things like that. And then China's come in and gazumped at us and said, oh, well, we'll give you a better deal, but just by the way, we need to have some bases where, on the Solomon Islands. And, obviously that for us has been we can't accept that. So I think that's sort of similar, albeit on a much more dramatic scale. So I think just in placing this NATO thing, it's actually not about a threat to Russia. It's about a threat to the Russian periphery and what that means and changes the balance. And I guess I did like one of the things you said before where you said he's a strong man, right? There's this identity tied up in it. And I think if you are someone who has had a wave of popular support because you took back Crimea in 2014, and then suddenly you're seen as a weak leader because countries like Ukraine are actually joining NATO, and this is his populism coming in, where it's no, he needs to do things like this to fight back to NATO, because if he doesn't fight back to NATO, he's not playing the game that's worked for him in the past.
Yeah, and I think we were talking about at the start of this episode about management consulting tropes, and the proof of concept is a big one, right? And this is where it's a fallacy and it breaks down. Crimea in a lot of ways emboldened and was that proof of concept, that you can not only invade and take control very quickly, but your domestic and your civilian population would praise you. Your approval rating will go up. It's aligned with what the Russian people want, or at least as we kind of receive that message. So he's kind of rewarded for doing these things, for taking land.
And what about on the other side? So one view is we should have, NATO should have done more to accommodate Russia and should have, moved out the way a little bit more. But then there's like another school of camp, like the Hawks saying, no, we should never have tolerated Putin. Like we should have put sanctions on the moment Putin did anything to challenge the sovereignty of other nations. And it's a bit like trying to manage children, right? Like if you don't set boundaries and intervene early, then they get like ahead of, that they're in, an idea that they're
Give
in
an
control.
inch, take a mile, right?
That's right. And so I don't know that necessarily this NATO argument from the West's perspective necessarily leads to a conclusion of rolling over and giving Putin a little bit more leeway, because I think then you just embolden him to do more of the same. Like he'll go and do it again.
Well, I think it's also equally the response, right? The international response to Crimea. There were lessons learned there too around inaction
Yes.
and testing the waters there on that side too. So Andy, we've spoken about Putin's official reasoning, like the PR campaign, that it's about humanitarian mission, liberating the Russian people from persecution in Ukraine. What do you think is the real reason? What's the column B? What does Putin actually want? We already touched on the incentives, but what were the incentives for him doing this?
So I don't know if you're into betting, right? But when you do sports betting, let's say it's like a football match, right? You're basically looking at two sides, and it's even odds unless one is favored to win or not, right?
Yeah.
And it might pay 2-1. But a horse race is a little bit different because you might have 15 or 20 horses in the race, and so even the favorite will pay like 3 or 4-1 if it's a hot favorite at that. So I think that's probably a better description of the case in this. So I don't necessarily have any great confidence of what the key factor is, but if I had to bet and nominate one, and with the caveat that I hold it with not necessarily a high degree of confidence, only that I prefer it to the other theories. So Putin's just turned 70 and he's been in power for a very long time. I think he is now thinking more about personal legacy. And in the context of the eve of the invasion last year, I think what happened is, in thinking, do I pull the trigger or not? I think he's thinking, look, I'm a 70-year-old man. I've got maybe another 15, 20 years left in me. And I have the chance to be revered as one of the great leaders of Russia. And I was very successful in taking Crimea. I think I can get away with it again. It'll be a quick victory, and I'll go down in history as one of the greats.
Yeah.
And he miscalculated. And so instead of going down as one of the greats, he's potentially going to go down as the man who ruined Russia forever. We don't know yet. There's a lot of this story to be written, but I think his age and that he's already done he's already been leader for so long. What else is there for him to do than to be the great leader? And this is the thing. This is the way he can be the great leader.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's COVID does weird things to us all, let's be honest, but I think his time in isolation and the writing of that essay, which pretty much he's kind of formed a narrative of returning Russia to greatness, and it's turning an eye to his legacy. So I think it's where he wants to play in. Now, how much he believes from that or not, I'm not going to comment, but that has aligned with the opportunity, right? Like, the West is weak. I got away with it, like you said before, with Crimea, and my people love me for it because it fits with my strong man, and regaining some of the dignity back for the Russian people too. I think that's a really important part of it as well, right? Like this idea that no matter how bad things get in Russia, you're still Russian. You're still a superpower.
So you had this unique window of time where the United States had just been humiliated from its exit from Afghanistan. You had Angela Merkel stepping down as Chancellor of Germany, and a newcomer kind of seen actually as kind of weak, or that wouldn't be strong against Putin. You had
Brexit.
A whole range of factors, and just COVID kind of causing disruption. You had this, he saw it as a window of opportunity to strike, and he did. All right, so we've talked a little bit about the West's involvement earlier in terms of supply of weapons, but of course, probably more influentially, the bigger intervention in terms of a direct hit on Russia was all the sanctions. So I guess one of the questions to do with sanctions is how effective they were, because it hasn't changed the outcome of the war. What kind of role, or how do you feel about the role of sanctions in the war so far?
The sanctions, I believe, have and will play a big part. And I think that Russia, as it always does, is underreporting the impact to look strong. It hits the kind of confidence of the people as well. What happens there around kind of losing talent and losing human resources, it's unmanageable as well. Like people fleeing Russia due to hitting people where it hurts, right? Because I think, sometimes you think of Cold War, like Soviet lifestyle, but really Russia is like a modern European existence for most people, right? Especially in the big cities. But it's changed now. So I think, you're asking a lot of your people, and yeah, I think it will eventually hurt the war machine and kind of trapping these kind of assets in there. And I think energy is probably something that we need to touch on in a minute. But the part that really kind of caught my imagination was, I don't know if you've been following it, but the sanctions or the seizure of Russian super yachts. Have you heard about any of this?
Yeah.
It's to me, that is such an interesting concept, because like it does a couple of things. Number one, it shows you how long of an arm the US sanctions law is, right? So there was one huge one called Amadeus, and it was I think it was like a super yacht, right? I think it was only like 100 meters short of a destroyer in length. Huge thing, right? Opulent to the max. And it was one of the oligarchs owned it, and it was seized off the coast of Fiji. And it's like, how did they get it in Fiji? And they got it because sanctions apply to using the US dollar. It's actually using the American financial system. And as soon as they do that, they can seize it on sanctions. And it's also interesting because it's showing the Russian people, like putting them face to face with the corruption of it all. Like this idea and this ideology around communism and kind of ownership and stuff. It's like, look actually what jobs for the boys results in, right? Look at this obscene wealth and these people, So I found that really interesting. And I think that it's going to have more of a longer term effect on the Russian people and closing off Russia from the rest of the world. Now, I have another question to you around, is that part of the intention here? Like, they tell this story of all the corporates leaving Russia, right? Like all the private business, if you will, pulling out, and essentially Russia going back, 100 years in time in terms of the look and feel, no Western influence. Is this something that ultimately Putin wants, like a return to true Russian culture and values?
I think there's probably definitely a aspiration to, kind of curb Western influences on Western culture, and to the extent that that's occurring, it might be seen as less bad than it might otherwise be. But I think, at the end of the day, if there's economic devastation because Western money and assets and investments have been pulled out, then, that's probably only of partial comfort. But just to go back to the impact of the sanctions, I mean, you said it's having an impact on, like life in Russia is like a modern existence. But I think that's actually why they haven't actually been that effective, is because I don't think that's actually the case. So I think there's definitely people living in Moscow and St. Petersburg, people who are more wealthy and higher incomes and kind of live that more kind of European lifestyle, then, it may be having some impact. But most people in Russia by head count, don't actually live those kind of lives. Like most people in Russia by head count, probably their lives are not too dissimilar than they were during the Soviet Union, or in some cases they're even worse, particularly for older people. So I think the fact that like McDonald's pulled out of Russia and has been replaced by some, dodgy Russian alternative,
McZulov's,
yeah, is not of any loss to many people. And then you added in parallel importing. I mean, you can still get an iPhone in Russia. It just comes via Kazakhstan. So there's all these kinds of things happening. And I guess, one of the things that's kind of floating around is this notion that energy has never been more affordable than it has now, because all the Russian energy is going into the domestic market, and petrol prices have collapsed, and that's a great thing. Whereas the West is like having to deal with like massive increases in energy costs. So just to answer the specific question of like, are sanctions actually having an impact? They aren't in the short term, but in the medium to longer term, that's when they will start to impact, because basically Russia has killed off the goose that laid the golden egg, in that it will no longer be regarded as a reliable energy partner in Europe. that's like will have permanent damage to the Russian economy.
Yeah, I think in 2014, when Russia invaded Crimea, I think there was large-scale criticism that the sanctions didn't go far enough, and they didn't touch gas, which essentially makes up a third of the Russian economy and 40% of total exports and things. And you have some countries' reliance on it, like Germany. They have over 75% reliance Russian gas at the time, and I think that's been one of the big things that changed this time round. That it can no longer be tolerated that the money that you're paying for your energy and your gas, Russian gas, can be linked directly to the conflict in Ukraine. And even trying to pawn it off on China, right? They had to do that at a discounted rate. So there's always this question around a Western belief that the Russian population or the average Russian is totally bamboozled by propaganda. And if I'm sure they feel the same way about the West. What's actually going on here in terms of the messages we're hearing?
I do feel like this is like the biggest example of like global gaslighting known to mankind. You've got like basically a whole population in Russia that's essentially brainwashed and subject to propaganda, that are convinced that the West is subject to propaganda and is brainwashed. So it's like, and it's very tortuous to kind of go through those sorts of conversations, but just to kind of crack open the nut, like, are we really like the ones that aren't brainwashed, and is it really Russians who are brainwashed? Like, which side do we land on? I think we can be confident that we get a much more balanced view of this conflict than those in Russia for a couple of reasons. First of all, you don't go to jail in Australia and in the West if you say something that doesn't match like the party line, or doesn't match the state sanctioned kind of narrative of what's going on. So that's like a pretty big one. You've got like free and open press that make a living out of like challenging what the government basically has to say about the conflict, whereas you don't have that in Russia. You have basically state controlled media, and indeed all of the last vestiges of sort of independent press have since been wiped
down.
Yeah, all gone. So I think we can be confident that that indeed, yes, we are on the right side of all of this. The only thing I would say though is that and I notice this too when you read, it's such an easy narrative to like fall into, is the good versus evil, and we won't really kind of look at the more complex and rich factors underpinning this conflict and just go straight to Putin's like Hitler reincarnated, right? Which is an oversimplification of what's going on. So there are some biases in the Western media and all of that.
Yeah, I think a really good one. I mean, so first of all, I totally agree, and I think that there's kind of laws in place that essentially, as a journalist, if you come out with a statement that hasn't quoted the state source, it's like you can be arrested. I mean, that is actually crazy, right? Like, so you just do not have an open and free press. How can you actually, how can you have journalism? Is it's a hard thing to wrap your head around, right? And I think this is probably where some of these ideologies clash, right? But a good example of on the other, when the shoe's on the other foot, we kind of in the West probably do it in a different way, right? Like, take for example the explosion of the Nord Stream pipelines, right? So the Nord Stream pipelines are essentially a massive undersea channel that connects that delivers Russian gas to Germany, and mysteriously both pipes were blown up last year. And the narrative in the West by Western media is that the Russians did it. They self-sabotaged their own pipelines, when there's really no proof of that, or the motives don't exactly make sense for a lot of people on the outside. Yet, in the West, that's what we kind of believe is the prevailing narrative. So that's not propaganda, I suppose, but but it is a narrative that is suggested in the reporting and the press that you then kind of believe, and it's antagonistic, of course, playing to that old trope of the Russians being cloak and dagger and still stuck in these, stagecraft, fieldcraft ways. But anyway, do you think there are other examples that you've seen where the narrative's been bent without the right evidence?
Yeah, well, I mean, look, just with Nord Stream, I think no one knows who did it, right? There are ways that both sides could benefit from it, I guess. So it's just that's what's tricky there. But I do want to just say with in terms of like Russian propaganda is that like why do they believe it? Like because people in Russia, I mean, and when we say like why do they believe it? Like we're talking about some of the most like outlandish, crazy kind of elements of it, right? Not just the NATO stuff, which is like plausible, but like the stuff about Nazis and like babies being eaten kind of stuff, right?
Yeah.
And I do think it's worth just kind of putting on the table the psychology of propaganda, that it's only effective because the people kind of subjected to it actually want to believe it or have some basis that it affirms some identity of what it is to be Russian, or it makes you feel good about your country that's doing something that maybe otherwise you would maybe not have reason to support. And I can give actually a real world example of how propaganda and how effective it is and the psychology of it. When the invasion occurred, I remember speaking to someone who I know who is of Russian background, and I spoke to them about it, and I asked, so what do you think about the invasion? And the answer was very clear and unequivocal that the war is bad, Putin is bad, this is all really bad, and it's not good, basically. And that was not like a kind of a weakly held view. That was expressed somewhat confidently. Within literally 7 days is all it took for that to be 180 degrees opposite, to be, oh no, the war is good, Putin is doing the right thing, there's Nazis in Ukraine, people are being killed. Like, because if you identify as a Russian person and you buy into the concept that your identity is partially that you are of a background of a great power, and yes, in the breakup of the Soviet Union, in some ways lost that status of being a great power, and now this is a narrative that kind of gives you back your status and your perceived sense of identity. So it's like a nice, it's a convenient thing to believe.
Yeah, and I think that's the problem for me, right? Like, how do you really know in a country that is that has state-based media, control of media? There is a history of being arrested, punished, tortured, exiled for expressing dissidence. It's very, very hard to get any kind of polling or any kind of idea of what people really feel like. And if you know that there are those consequences, why even let yourself think that? And so it becomes this ever more kind of tightening noose around your neck. So I think it's really impossible to tell in some ways. And I do think that the fact that a lot of Russians get their information from still televised sources does kind of play into this as well. It becomes a bit easier as a channel to manipulate the messages that are going to them. But hey, like I think that's the thing, we don't really know. But I do agree with you that the psychology of it is fascinating, and I do think this idea of a return to greatness, and the idea that your whatever humiliations or sufferings or losses or defeats you might face only makes you stronger, and you ultimately will return. And that the kind of Russian personality is based on that, right? It's kind of outlast, and survive, and be tough, endure.
All right, so we've taken a bit of a helicopter tour of this conflict so far. I think we've got to very much acknowledge that we're having this conversation partway through a live conflict that's evolving and changing, and there's talk of like an offensive coming up as winter thaws. And I guess we've just recently passed the 12-month anniversary of the conflict. So I guess I wanted to maybe briefly enter speculative mode and maybe discuss like where does this all go, like how will the war end, and what are some of the factors that both sides should be considering in terms of like escalation and maybe suing for peace, for example.
Yeah, and I think this is the part that is quite feels quite hopeless at the moment, because I think that the interests are aligned for a bit of a prolonged conflict at this stage, right? So I guess there's a couple of ways couple of options I guess I want to put down and kind of talk about. And I think maybe let's talk about them as we go rather than listing them all out. The first one that I think we should discuss together is an option where Ukraine takes back all the territory that Russia has seized, and including Crimea. And it's something that is suggested that could be achieved, and some people believe will be achieved over time and continuing support, international support from a military point of view. Now, while some analysts believe this could occur, and like I said, Ukraine has taken back over 50% of territories from Russia since the war began, the huge kind of con to this obviously is two things really. One is it's taking a hell of a lot of money to support the war by international players, and there may not be the ability to continue to do that. There's already a huge amount of political pressure from the US, who provides the vast majority of the military support. And two, the escalation of that. And for all the reasons that we spoke about, that Putin's a strong man, he doesn't want to lose faith, and if he thinks he's cornered and thinking about his legacy, he may reach for that black suitcase that he has access to, and things might escalate to using nuclear weapons.
That's actually Zelensky's current, that's what he's working to, basically. So
that's what he says he wants to do.
Yeah. So earlier on in the conflict, there was actually a willingness to formally recognize Crimea as part of Russia and as part of a negotiated peace. But once there were quite significant gains made, counterattack successes, that option came off the table. So from Zelensky in Ukraine's perspective. So they're fighting for it. And look, one of the, I think, reasons for it is that there is a sense that Ukraine could not have a viable degree of stability if the pre-war borders were not restored. It would just be this, they're just going to come for another attack later at some point.
Yeah, they'll just come next summer.
So, yeah, this is it'd be like the piecemeal approach to war, right? So I think that's why they're kind of taking that approach. Can they achieve it? Well, absolutely they can achieve it, because they've shown that they can outclass the Russian military and the Russian attack. But I guess the question is, what other tricks does Russia have up its sleeves? I mean, I think one of the biggest questions at this time, as we're recording it, and no doubt by the time it's released, this may have developed and moved on and evolved, but is the prospect of China supplying weaponry to Russia. And we don't know, there could be...
But they have a 12-point peace plan.
Well,
I saw it on Twitter.
Yes. Yep. So if that does happen, it might be a game changer for Russia. But there's all sorts of areas where there's very significant capacity constraints within the Russian military. There's a lot of speculation that at the moment you have a war fought by basically people that no one cares about, mercenaries and prisoners, and that once you start kind of sending regular Russian people who have, mothers and sisters and brothers and other, it changes the game a little bit, and that might alter public support.
It already has. So I think that's probably something to call out, that it's one of the promises that Putin did make, that he to the mothers of Russia, that he wouldn't call on the civilian reserves to be essentially conscripted in, and he has. All right, let's go a little bit further into the middle. So the next option is essentially the concept of armistice, which isn't a peace treaty of any kind. Essentially, it's a ceasefire. And this could be forced potentially if, say, America decided to defund Ukraine and say, look, stop advancing or we won't send any more shells. Take the air out of it, and essentially we draw the lines of the map where they stand. So the idea here is that we have a ceasefire. Putin can claim that he has managed to essentially gain back eastern parts of the Donbass and holds Crimea, and Zelensky compromises. So this has been put forward as an option too, and one that may be realized purely because Europe and the West no longer want to or can afford to fund the war.
The trade-offs between continuing to pursue the end state outcome and the human cost of pursuing that. Yeah, I think that's definitely a key consideration. But at the same time, and one thing that, well, we've talked a lot about America and the West and all of that, but one thing that always seems missing from a lot of these conversations is, what about Ukraine and the Ukrainian people? And they don't seem to want to do this. They want to fight for their country. And, this is actually not about the West and America. This is actually about Ukraine and the Ukrainian people. So I think at the end of the day, if the mood changes in Ukraine, then that might come on the table.
Yeah, I agree. It is actually something that is missing in a lot of these strategic discussions. But let's be honest here. If military support was pulled tomorrow, the war would be over. We do need to throw in here as an option of how things could eventuate over this conflict is actually Putin himself being removed. So by a variety of different methods, and politically or perhaps through assassination as well.
Yeah, well, of course, a lot of the outcomes we've just talked about might require that. And that's indeed why they will be resisted from within the Putin regime, because, like, for example, even an armistice is probably questionable whether that's, like, if he can't say we were victorious, and I'm not sure he can under an armistice.
Well, he can say he's, Russia is bigger, at 1% bigger, 0.01%.
Well, I suppose it's all how you can frame it. The only outcome that's going to be consistent with Putin sort of surviving is the one that he can talk to his cronies and say, look, we've achieved success.
Or he's liberated the Donbass from the Nazis.
Yeah. Maybe that's why we've got so many crazy justifications for the war, because he needs to have a few exit points. But I guess there's a couple of things with him, finishing up. The first is that even a good thing? Because you don't know who, like, sometimes it's better the devil you know kind of thing, because if the vacuum is some unknown, volatile sort of, maybe the pushback to Putin is like an internal revolt because Putin didn't go hard enough. It's not necessarily, the leader who's going to be, what we really need to do now is go and, like, hold hands with our Ukrainian friends and plant flowers together, and right. So that just comes with, like, a whole bunch of additional risk. But I guess maybe the relevant thing to consider isn't so much like he gets removed and that's the end of the war, as opposed to, like, how this impacts his decision making and how this threat of regime change, and it's now like life or death for him. It's not just, do I get, like, good poll results? It's like, it's literally, he could lose his life if he is purged and tried and held accountable for all of the things that went wrong. So he's got to navigate, and that's going to affect his decision making. So, I mean, one of the kind of features of this conflict that is new, certainly in recent history, is open threats of the use of nuclear weapons by a nuclear state in a way that we just haven't seen before or any time.
And what do you think this is doing psychologically to everyone, right? Because the common feeling of, mad, mutually assured destruction, and the doctrine around, it's pointless going into, even, the sort of threatening action of nuclear weapons, right, was so unheard of in our lifetime, I suppose. For all this to change right now, where do you think this leads us?
Well, I think most people are just sort of, seem to be kind of, and maybe this is like wishful thinking, but placing it as, this is just the leverage, right? This is just me kind of pushing the envelope in a way that maybe he's not even comfortable himself about, but, maybe it's like that high stakes gamble where I'll mention the nuke word, right? This is his make or break opportunity, and he's like, if he's ever going to threaten use of nukes, then he'll do it now. But the only thing is, as well, like, when people talk about his use of nukes in this conflict, the type of weapon that I think most people are kind of assuming that would come into play would be a tactical nuclear weapon. It wouldn't necessarily trigger the whole stock aimed at Moscow and Los Angeles, New York, and every other city and country in between.
My God. It's very hard to wrap your head around. Time to get that bunker. Hey, Andy? I don't know, Andy, if you listened to Zelensky's plea to the Russian people in that speech.
Yeah, not to make light of it, but was it better than the penis piano video?
That was the next one that was really on YouTube afterwards. Yeah, so obviously a long way to go, but